it's tough to talk about the cement space in India right now and start with anything other than consolidation.
Yes, consolidation is the right theme buzzword right now in the industry. We've seen fairly 3 or 4 large acquisitions in the recent past. When we are in that moment, we think this is the first time this has happened in the industry. But this is something we witness every 7-8 years in the industry.
Whenever there's serious consolidation in an industry, how does it actually affect the financials and outcomes for the players that remain?
It's very regional. There are different players and there are so many players with strong balance sheets. It's going to be a long journey to reach where telecom has reached.
I have seen companies in the cement space use everything from family emotions to scantily clad women to sell their products. What I'm trying to understand is, what is the net effect that all these promotional campaigns have on the actual sell-through of these companies?
Back in the day, cement used to be more or less a commodity industry. He came in and he revolutionized the entire industry.
Are there things today that people are maybe not giving sufficient attention to, that they should be thinking about a lot more?
There are 2 risks that I see. One is
My guest today is Satyadeep Jain of Ambit Capital. At Ambit, Satyadeep leads research in the areas of metals, cement, utilities, and new energy. We cover a range of topics relating to the cement sector in this conversation, including the ongoing consolidation in the space, how companies can improve their financials, and interesting examples of branding in what is largely seen as a commoditized industry. We hope you find the conversation insightful and instructive.
Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having the question.
Satya, it's tough to talk about the cement space in India right now and start with anything other than consolidation. Can you offer viewers some context in terms of both recent developments in the space in terms of consolidation and some historical perspective? Is consolidation a new trend in the cement space, or has it always been the case?
Yes, consolidation is the right theme buzzword right now in the industry. We've seen fairly 3 or 4 large acquisitions in the recent past. There is one, Kesoram being acquired, India Cement. Then you had other 2 acquisitions. There's JP Acid, which is under the NCLT. There is Penna Cement, which got acquired. So we've seen fair bit of M&A in the recent past, including the Sanghi Cement acquisition, which Adani did. But this is, when we are in that moment, we think this is the first time this has happened in the industry. But this is something we witness every 7-8 years in the industry. If we go back into 1990s, that is the first time I believe the entire consolidation started happening in the industry. That is when Modi Cement got acquired. We had DLF Cement that got acquired by Ambuja. Even Lafarge, Tata Steel that we see right now, historically, a lot of cement assets were erstwhile Tata Steel. So Lafarge acquired Tata Steel assets in the late 90s. What we see as Ultratech today was actually L&T Cement assets, which Grasim acquired at the beginning of the century. Then over time, we've seen other acquisitions, Ambuja acquiring ACC, a majority stake in ACC in a way. Then the last wave of acquisition, the entire M&A that happened was in 2016, 17, 18 era, when Ultratech acquired JP assets. At that time, if we go back, Ultratech right now is almost 160 million ton capacity. At that time, it was 70 odd million ton capacity, and it acquired almost 17 to 20 million ton of JP capacity. So if you look at the proportion on a relative basis, what they acquired and what is happening, that was mainly one asset itself, which was 30% of Ultratech's capacity at that time. And then you had Binani, which was a fairly big asset in Rajasthan, North India at that time. And then around the same time, Reliance Cement got acquired by Birla Cement. So there has been this consolidation that we've seen. So this is now what we've seen after that entire 2016-18 led And in the middle, you've also had Dalmia acquiring certain assets through NCLT. Recently, Saga Cement also acquired another asset. So this is something we've seen for so many years. In that entire consolidation, it's not just that some existing players have got taken over. Some new entrants have also come in the industry. You've seen, if you see that the RK Marble Group, they are known for the marbles, but they have this Wonder Cement asset, which is the largest. We look at Shree Cement as one of the largest assets in Ras Biawar. Possibly back in the day, we used to think of this as being the single largest location asset. But not many people know that Wonder Cement has the single location, one location, biggest clinker plant in the entire country, and they're not even listed, so many people don't know about it. We have JSW Cement, which is gotten big over time and has ambitious plans. JK Cement, which was relatively small earlier on, has become relatively big. So in their entire consolidation theme, you've also seen, despite the high barriers to entry in the entire business, we've also seen some new players in the industry. So it's something that's been happening. This is not just an Indian phenomenon; that has happened on a global scale also. But yeah, happy to talk more about it.
So the main question everyone has whenever there's serious consolidation in an industry is, how does it actually affect the financials and outcomes for the players that remain? And in recent times, if you think in the Indian context, you think of paints, you think of telecom more obviously, there's been this idea that the two or three players that do remain actually enjoy a sort of oligopolistic market and therefore gain a lot from that. What I want to understand from you is that a fair assumption when it comes to the cement space in India? Is it the case that we can look at some of these other sectors and say, we're just going to rewatch the same movie in the cement space?
There are obviously the telecom one becomes a fairly relevant example for many, given what we've seen even on the paint side as well. Cement is somewhat different in all these industries. If you see telecom, for instance, it's largely become a duopoly with two large players taking over the entire market share and commanding pricing power. In paints, you've had a new player come into the segment, and to be able to take market share, how does that? It's ultimately a zero sum game. You have incumbents who are already well entrenched, who have market share. A new guy comes in and goes to the customer that you buy my product. And why would a dealer and everybody try to sell your product? So you have to. Since it's a zero sum game, you have to offer something. Maybe usually it's still lower prices. Cement is relatively different from these two sectors. It is ultimately, if you look at cement, there is very high freight to volume ratio. Because the freight is relatively high in the proportion of overall cost or pricing, it becomes more of a regional play. It's not a national. It's not like you have two players in the entire country commanding. You have to go into regions and go into this, not just regions. You cannot have South India. We can't just say South India. Within South India, there are different states. South India has many South Indias for cement industry because Tamil Nadu is different. Andhra Pradesh would be different. There are different dynamics for each region. So you really have to go into each district. So for a player, you need to, there might be at the global scale, you might be large, but in that particular district, somebody may be able to outcompete you. There are cases, so if you go into various parts of India, and we go to Kerala, let's say, there are customers, there are people who would say that I won't do dhalai of my house if it's not a Ramco cement product. People actually take immense pride in the fact that they've used Ramco cement in their house. If you go to North India, which is something similar, people feel for Wonder Cement. Builders will tell you that we've used only Ultratech or Wonder Cement product in our house. That's how they sell the housing construction projects in Delhi and in the northern parts of India. When you go to East, you had Lafarge, which was fairly big, and those assets got taken over by Novoco. So certain Novoco products, Concreto products, and all command very high recall and pricing. And people, something similar to what I said for Ramco, there people take immense pride in saying that we have a Nuvoco product in our house. So it's very regional. There are different players, and there are so many players with strong balance sheets that you still. There are many players who are well capitalized, who have strong balance sheets. So it's we've not we are nowhere close to the stage where we've seen how things have played out in telecom. We'll see how maybe ultimately, who knows, we'll get there, but it's going to be a long journey to reach where telecom has reached.
It's interesting. The examples you're giving, it's like, I think of, for example, when buying a laptop, it's a big thing to write Intel inside, right? That it's like, even though the customer is buying the laptop, the fact that there's an Intel chip is an incentive to buy it. You don't think of that generally in something like cement. But I want to now talk about individual cases. I don't want to get into names and, why did X do this and why do that? But just try and understand and enter the mind of the acquirer when evaluating potential acquiring businesses. Can you talk about how, if you were the promoter or you were the CEO of a company and you were evaluating potential acquisition opportunities, what are the key things that you would look for in that acquisition, in that target, to try and judge whether this is the right fit for me or not?
It's obviously for a promoter, for company, not just for cement, for any company, it's ultimately build versus buy. You're trying to see your returns on investment on building something, and that may, given the high barriers to entry that cement typically has, you may believe that to be able to get a sizable footprint in one particular region. As I mentioned, it's ultimately regional. So if you don't have, let's say, limestone in one particular region, you don't have land, because all these are time consuming, acquiring land, limestone. These are somewhat high barriers to entry. And then you don't have distribution networks. So let's say, unless you're a pan India player, there are possibilities that you may be a category A player in one region where you have the highest brand recall you can think of. People think of you as the most highly valued cement company, most reputed cement company in one region, but in another region, people may not even know about you. So the idea is, if you're looking at diversifying your presence into other regions, you may think building something of my own is going to take a long time. And so that is usually one criteria. It gives you access to an existing footprint. It gives you access to dealers. It gives you access to the brand the company may already have in that region. In certain other cases, it might be the case that when you especially look at some of the smaller players, they have not invested so much in branding and advertisement. So the same quality of product, as you mentioned, Intel, so the product is almost similar. It's ultimately, at the end of the day, no matter what we say, it's a commodity. So, but in the minds of the customer, he may think, and ultimately cement, and we'll maybe talk more about how this entire branding evolved in cement. But ultimately, cement is only 5% of the overall construction cost. So in the customer's mind, he may think that why do I take risk? Given it's only 5%, but it can have far-reaching implications if I settle for something weaker quality. So typically, somebody else might be selling the same cement at a lower price, and you go and say, I can buy this company, and using my own brand, the same product I can sell at a higher price. So and you raise the overall EBITDA per ton and overall economics for that particular asset. So these are certain reasons. The other reason could be, let's say you already have a fairly large asset base in one particular region, and this is to keep somebody else from entering that cement. It's not happened only in cement. It's happened. I've seen that in steel globally. In many cases, you are a leader in one particular region, and there is a competing asset that comes into play. Now there is a possibility that somebody else acquires that asset and comes into your region and starts competing with you. So one of the reasons could be you want to acquire that to stop somebody else from entering. And so it's not just your incremental ROC. So when we look at the return on investment, return on capital employed, it is not just the incremental return you generate on new investment that you do. It's also the return on investment on the existing capital employed you have in that particular state. So sometimes you want to protect that asset you've already built, or maybe generate higher return on that asset because you're acquiring a new asset. And if you acquire that asset, maybe there's a possibility your entire market share in that particular region, keeping in mind that the Competition Commission of India, you don't want to breach that particular level, but it gives you more consolidation, more pricing power. So it can be a combination of various things to improve your market reach, to improve your footprint, to diversify, to also keep your competition out of that particular market. So those are some very basic, but there are obviously there's going to be some more, but the main ones would be these ones.
Right. From what you have seen, not just in recent times, but just in studying the space for, over many decades that you've seen deals happen, do you think that businessmen are as cold-blooded and calculative as we like to believe? Or do you think that even these massive multi-billion-dollar deals sometimes are driven by, I can't let him have it, sort of, almost the way children fight, right? Like, I don't necessarily want it, but I don't want him to have it either. So I'm going to go ahead and buy it. It sounds very silly considering what's at stake. But do you think that there is some amount of emotion that drives some of these M&A decisions?
I won't hate mentioning another book, but it's so interesting just to mention in this particular context. I was reading this book, Cold Steel, when ArcelorMittal was acquired. Mittal Steel acquired ArcelorMittal, and you have to really, when you look at that kind of cross-border M&A, to see what kind of emotions are involved. There is a bit of racism, there is denial, there is emotion of, I can sell it to anybody but him. Right? So that if you read that, you'll see the context of that acquisition, that the seller was ready to sell it to anybody else but him but for different reasons, mainly emotional. And there was some bit of racism also. But when we've seen in the context of India, there are various reasons for consolidation. There could be various, as I mentioned, there is one historical context. Maybe as reason for one of the M&A was to keep one of the acquirers, somebody else at bay, let's say, just to maintain your market share and pricing in that region. There could be other reasons to not let somebody else acquire. There could be cases where somebody rushed into a deal, acquired that asset within a very short period of time, just to make sure nobody else comes in and acquires. And I'm talking from a real example standpoint without naming some of these companies. But it's ultimately, when these promoters are acquiring these companies, they don't go into maintaining a spreadsheet and doing DCF and all like we may do. Ultimately for them, there is an emotional aspect also. And they may think longer term, I want to maintain market share. I want to grow in this particular region, no matter at what cost it right now comes. Maybe it may give me a better standpoint later on. There are certain acquisitions that we've seen where it's for whatever reason, it's taken way too long and gone to somebody else. But there is a interesting business case in most of these cases. There has to be some merit in acquiring. Its consolidation, its build versus buy. But if you look at the history of, generally not talking about India or cement, but if you look at the history, there's actually a paper written by NYU professors and all also, that M&A in general, historically, globally, has been value destructive. That it's but there are cases where people have made a lot of, for good M&A, they've acquired assets, they've built. And in cement, we've seen that with certain acquisitions, they've helped companies scale up, gain market in certain regions.
Yeah. Buffett talks about it, right? Like, it's why companies rarely do post-mortems of acquisitions, because then they have to admit they made a mistake. But Satya, I want to now talk about one of my favorite. Sorry,
one
please.
Thing I forgot to mention, typically what also happens is most of the M&A will be at the top of the cycle. At that cycle, you're also exuberant. You think the cycle, and not just cement, any other industry, because I cover many cyclical industries. And you have a large access to capital, generating so much cash. The cost of capital is the lowest at the top of the cycle. That you're trying to figure out how to grow. Shareholders are asking you, analysts are asking you, where is growth? And then you have access to all the capital. But the challenge is at the bottom of the cycle, when the assets are actually cheap and all, you may not have the balance sheet to go out and acquire. So that's also the other challenge that happens. Anybody structurally, if you've seen companies who've done well over time, are the ones who've been more conservative and they've had the balance sheet to go out and acquire assets at the bottom of the zone.
I guess game theory would lead any CEO or promoter to this conclusion that sometimes he has no choice but to acquire it. And maybe at some level they may have to overpay at certain times, but keeping in mind the bigger picture, they have no choice.
You know, Satya, when I was researching companies in the space prior to our conversation,
I was looking at P&Ls of various cement companies.
I want to now walk through a typical P&L statement for a cement company and understand from you how to gauge whether the management is doing a good job running the business. So there's three main line items and really three main costs that I want to talk to you about when it comes to cement. The first is the most obvious cost, which is raw material. Can you, keeping in mind the entire value chain, explain how cement companies go about mitigating the impact of that cost, and to what extent can they keep that cost in control?
When you look at the entire P&L, let's start with realization and then we can go to costing. So you're selling cement at 350 rupees per bag. Largely, if you're a category A player selling at the highest price, so taking that example, one bag is 50 kg per bag. So that translates into 50 kg, about 7 rupees per kg. That's roughly 7,000 rupees per ton. On that, you have to pay GST of 28%. Then you have some dealer incentives that you have. So in this particular case, your net realization that you book would be somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500 rupees per ton. And I've used 350 rupees per bag, but actual price in the market right now is somewhat lower than that. When you look at the cost items compared to that, as rightly mentioned, there are two or three main key line items. One is your power and fuel costs, then your freight, and then raw material. And lastly would be your employee costs and other expenses, which is largely your sales, distribution, packing. So when you look at each one of them, the biggest one is typically your power and fuel cost, which is anywhere from 30-35% of your total cost. So that depends on one or two factors. One is, so when you look at power, your power requirement in any particular cement plant would be somewhere between 70 to 80 units of power per ton of cement. Then you go into how much is the cost of power per unit of power. It could be anywhere from as low as 3 rupees per unit on a weighted average basis to as high as maybe 7 rupees per unit. So it's a combination. The variance is a combination of how efficient the plant is. So if it uses less power compared to other plants, the other is the cost of power. And we can talk separately about the cost, the economics of power. But that gives you overall, on an average, 500 rupees per ton of power, give or take. The next is fuel. And so ultimately, cement is a very fuel-intensive process. The process is you have clinker, two stages in a cement production process. One is clinker production and the other one is cement production. So clinker production happens in clinker line, the other one happens in grinding unit. So to be able to produce clinker, you need a lot of fuel. You're basically converting calcium carbonate into calcium oxide line. So you need roughly 750 kilocalories of fuel per kg of clinker. And then you look at the cost of fuel. So it's a combination of, when you do the entire economics, it will come out to roughly 1,000 rupees per ton of fuel right now. So your power and fuel together would be 1,500 rupees. And that is roughly, if your overall cost is 4,000, this would be 30-35% of the overall cost. So in fuel, again, similar to power, how efficient your plant is. This fuel consumption back in the day used to be as high as 900, 1,000 rupees per ton. It's come down to 700, 750. In some cases, newer plants less than 700. So for the same production of clinker, you become so efficient that you use less fuel. And the other is the cost of fuel. So it's going to be a combination of things you can do to reduce the overall cost of fuel. So that gives you that fuel cost. The other one is freight cost. The cement, as I mentioned, is ultimately regional. So you would be your main clinker plant would be closer to your limestone mine. And then you want to reach the customer. And the ideal case is the customer should not be that far from your cement plant. The cement is regional because the cost of freight or the freight cost per weight per ton of cement is usually high. And that becomes even higher for limestone, some other products like aggregates. But mainly because of that, it becomes more of a regional place. You're trying to see if my plant is located in one particular region, I want to reach the customer in the most economic way. So give or take, let's say your lead distance to the customer is 300 kilometers. And so that's a lead distance. You can control it. There are various ways. And one of the pioneers in this was Shree Cement. And in all these things that I'm talking about, what Shree Cement did, everybody is now following in terms of how they optimize. And it's a case study. They go about it in their annual reports religiously and how various initiatives, squeezing costs as much as possible. So you're trying to optimize that lead distance. And then, so let's say your lead distance is 300 kilometers. And then the cost of freight, which is use of road, rail, partly sea is relatively small right now. But your weighted average cost of freight would be somewhere around 3 rupees per ton per kilometer. So if you look at that, your overall freight cost is 1,000 rupees per ton, which would be 25% of your overall cost. So when you look at the overall cost, these power and fuel and freight together will be 60% of the overall cost. Then you have the raw material, which is your limestone. And it's a combination of what kind of cement you produce. So if you produce more OPC, then you don't need as much other raw materials, fly ash and slag. But to be able to produce more OPC, your overall fuel consumption would be higher. So your fuel cost will be higher, but your raw material cost will be lower. And so your overall line items will change partly based on what kind of producer you are, what kind of products you make, how are you selling. Because if you are a category A player, a large company who spends a lot on marketing, they get the highest realization, but their other expenses would be higher. But speaking specifically of raw material cost, generally, if we assume an average company in terms of average product mix, it'll be around 500 rupees per ton. So that would be about 10-15% of your overall cost. The remaining is a combination of fixed and variable cost, which is your sales distribution, your packing cost, your employee expense. So that is how the typical P&L for a cement company looks like.
Right. And I'm trying to gauge who are the best companies for each of these different things, right? How does a company actually differentiate itself? So is there something that maybe isn't seen as a line item in the P&L, but is really the difference maker? And I'll give you an example. From what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Shree Cement does a exceptional job when it comes to plant design. And from what I've understood, they have a challenge acquiring companies sometimes because the plant design of the potential acquiree isn't up to their standards. So when they take into account the costs involved in redesigning the plant, it suddenly doesn't make as much sense. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on any individual company, but my point still is that is there something that certain companies are doing which you see as, okay, overall there's lower cost structure, but it's some real sort of unseen and maybe not necessarily sufficiently well thought out competitive advantage that they have built over the years?
There are a lot of advantages. Ultimately, it becomes a commoditized industry. I'll give you an example that, as I mentioned, Shree Cement pioneered a lot of things in the industry, and now everybody is copying those efforts. So one was when you're actually producing clinker, using all this fuel, using coal, using petcoke, but ultimately at the end of that process, there's a lot of waste gas that gets generated. So a lot of time that waste gas was going waste. We, as an industry, were not able to figure out. But Shree Cement figured out that why are we wasting that gas? Let's use that gas to generate power. And that can produce power at 1 rupee per unit versus 5-6 rupees. So there is a certain extent to which you can use WHRS, waste heat recovery, to lower your overall power cost. So they are the ones who started this, and now everybody is doing it. It reduces your power cost. As I mentioned, your return on investment on the WHRS is typically very high. It's a function of how much waste heat gas you generate historically and how much you can capture. So it's that's not common parlance, but the older plants actually generate more waste heat than the newer plants because they are less efficient. A less efficient plant will generate more waste heat than more efficient. But the more efficient plants are designed in such a way that they're able to capture more of that waste heat versus the older plants. That's the difference. But otherwise, that's what Shree Cement did historically. And then you had other cases. So historically, the way cement was structured was, let's say, you want to reach Delhi. Delhi is your end market, and your plant is in Rajasthan. So what people used to do is that you would set up your entire, as I mentioned, cement has two components. One is your clinker, the other one is grinding. So you had something called an integrated unit. Both the units were located in the same location. So Rajasthan, what you would do is you produce clinker, then you get fly ash, which is one of the raw materials that you require in producing cement at the grinding stage. You will procure it, have it travel from, let's say, Delhi to Rajasthan, grind it, and then send the product to Delhi. Then you are incurring freight not just on clinker, in a way, you're incurring freight on all the raw materials. So what the entire, it's like hub and spoke model that you have in airlines, also many other industries, but they pioneered the entire hub and spoke model in cement, where they said, we'll have something called a split grinding unit model, that we don't need to have the entire plant in one location. We'll have clinker line close to limestone. We'll have the cement plant close to an optimized location, which is closer to customer, but also closer to your fly ash and stuff you're optimizing. So in that is one of the ways to optimize your freight cost. So that is also something that's been done. On fuel costs, it is something that we've seen overall. So the other thing they did was on gypsum also, that you have natural gypsum. They pioneered something called synthetic gypsum, which had lower cost. They used wet ash to have fly ash, which a lot of cement companies use. But there's also wet ash for which legally the power plants cannot charge a price. Right now, so you get it free, but you have to install dryer and all. So a lot of these things for a long time. And right now, as I mentioned, companies can use coal and pet coke as fuel, but nobody actually knew that you could use pet coke as an alternative to coal. Everybody used to use coal. Free cement back in the day started using pet coke as a substitute to coal. And now, depending on the economics, sometimes pet coke is cheaper, sometimes coal, but you have something called alternative fuels.
But sorry, so why did nobody else realize?
It's just that they were pioneers in trying to improve productivity. They would go out and try to find out how can we best. And you have to really read the annual reports of Shree Cement to really get into their shoes and see how they are optimizing each and every single process in the entire value chain.
Right.
But the challenge is that, and this is a very interesting analogy. If you read Warren Buffett's 1982 letter, in that letter, so let's say you're Warren Buffett, you have a textile company, and I'm talking exactly in that letter that is mentioned. So there's an investment banker that comes to Warren Buffett saying that I have a very interesting proposition for you, that this investment that you make, this is a very cost-effective, cost-saving initiative. But you invest in this and your cost will come down. So Warren Buffett thinks this is a very interesting proposition, very attractive NAV and of this investment. I'm making this investment, but I'm saving so much. He gets excited and he goes ahead and makes that capital investment. Little does he realize, and he realizes later on, and it's ultimately a commodity business. The same banker goes to every single textile company in the industry and gives the same proposition. Everybody invests in that particular cost-saving initiative, and everybody's costs come down. So now the challenge in a commodity business, he says, is that when the entire cost curve for the entire industry comes down, you don't have the pricing power. The beneficiary is not the company, the industry. The beneficiary is the customer. So you lower the prices. And he gives another interesting analogy based on this, that you're watching a football match, that you want to get a better view of that match. What you do is you try to stand on your toes. The challenge is you stand on your toes and everybody else will do the same. And in the end, nobody gets a better view and everybody is worse off. So in this case also, you have more capital invested in the business to reduce cost, but it doesn't give you I'm using an analogy. I'm not saying this is something that will happen in cement, but this is in a commodity industry, unless you have a very unique proposition that nobody else can match, it becomes difficult. So you need to find out something unique proposition, but that's a big challenge to be able to differentiate and do something. Which is why companies they look at cost, but they also look at optimizing your footprint. So the more spread out your asset base is, ultimately the shorter the lead distance for that particular commodity, for that particular thing. And then it's branding. Right? So, and we go into branding as to what happened in other countries and how this entire thing evolved. But branding gives you in a way a competitive edge for that same product. You're able to charge a higher price versus the others. Within power, the only thing I would say is, as you look at the entire economics of power, there's going to be some differentiation. So imagine you are a cement company with a captive power plant in Gujarat or Himachal Pradesh or Maharashtra. Your source of coal, all the coal mines, fortunately, unfortunately, are in certain parts of India. It's not well spread out. So it's going to be east and some in southern India. So if you're a cement company in Gujarat, Rajasthan, some of these locations, you're buying that coal, so either an imported coal or you getting that coal delivered from, let's say, eastern part. So most usually the cost of power for all these states would be higher than the cost of. So the cost of power here could be as high as 6-7 rupees per unit, even though it's your own captive coal plant that you're using. If you go to east, Chhattisgarh, Odisha and all, the cost of power could be as, because they are right next to the coal mines, the cost of power could be as low as 3 rupees per unit. So that's when renewable energy comes in, the entire story flips, because all the renewable energy is actually in Rajasthan and Gujarat and southern states. So ultimately, right now, the transmission cost, there is ISTS waiver and all. Ultimately, when it goes away, the source of renewable energy would be more concentrated here, and we'll see how it pans out, because once the waivers go away, it's possibility that renewable energy also gets spread out. So that the cost saving magnitude as we see today compared to where we are would be higher in these particular locations. Whereas if you are in east, you're already on the lower end of the cost curve for power. So that is one differentiation which may happen. But by and large, if you look at the overall industry level, the question that I have as an analyst is, who is the ultimate beneficiary from what occurs?
I want to come back to something you've mentioned twice in this conversation, which is branding. And if I expanded into the advertising, marketing, I have seen companies in the cement space use everything from family emotions to scantily clad women to sell their products. What I'm trying to understand is, what is the net effect that all these promotional campaigns have on the actual sell-through of these companies? Can you talk about individual cases of brand campaigns or promotional activities that you've seen cement companies employ, whether it's in India or globally, that you think have been particularly effective at creating interest and demand for their products, given, like we have discussed in this conversation, that they are broadly commoditized products?
For that, we have to go back in again 90 in the previous century, when the interesting historical context you'll see in the book called Ambuja Story. So Narottam Seksaria, he's the one who founded Ambuja. So back in the day, cement used to be more or less a commodity industry. He came in and he revolutionized the entire industry. So, and they're very interesting analogy is that you obviously had dealers and all. He cut down on the dealer days and all, working capital, but he was very open to the idea of dealers also making money in the entire process. But he also hired representatives like you have in pharmaceutical industry, that you go and talk to all these dealers and figure out. And he said you should wear a tie and coat, because that in pharma, he saw that he thought people gave you more respect if you wear a tie and coat. So and then he hired this guy called, I'm not I'm recalling, maybe Rakesh Gupta, some way worldwide, but they together revolutionized the entire, I'm old enough, if I'm recalling that incident, it probably shows that I am in that generation, but there was this ad, now it's also modified, but ye diwar tootthi kyun nahi hai? That concept was started by Ambuja, and that is, if people started to associate one cement company with more strength, with better properties and stuff. So this entire branding journey actually started to a larger extent in that late 90s, maybe early 2000 era. Then it's overall taken over. So if you look at certain companies, position it differently, but at the end of the day, they want better recall. So Ultratech has a tagline called Engineer's Choice. Ambuja would have Virat Cement. They all have the basic idea they want to put in the mind of the customer is that we are we are stronger, superior, safer cement. So why would you not pay 20, 30 rupees per bag higher for our cement when the overall construction cost, it doesn't. So that's and now we've seen another level where we've seen a lot of movie stars, cricketers being hired to promote. So it's becoming overall that entire transition from commodity to partly it has become some semi-consumer where for the same, if you look at consumer products, people are willing to pay a higher price for one product over other. It's the same thing in cement. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the same by and large. I'm talking mainly from scientific experts and also that there might be some marginal difference in properties and qualities, but it's in the perception. The entire exercise of branding is to generate that kind of image in the mind of the customer. But India is a very unique market. In India, when you look at the entire cement consumption, it's 60% of that comes from housing. 20% from infrastructure and 20% from other commercial industrial. That housing is largely rural housing. So within the overall, let's say if you're consuming 100 tons of cement, 40 tons would be largely rural. So in that context, there is more sale to food distributors, dealers in India, because they are largely smaller players, either small contractors buying from distributors or maybe some people buying cements. And then there is mixer typically at the construction site or something. That if you look at US, it's the exact opposite. If you go to US, I was there for many years. I worked and I actually covered aggregate companies also in US. But when you go to US, you'll find it very hard to find a cement dealer selling cement bags. Back in many years ago, cement in US used to be, so there are two ways cement is sold. One is cement is sold in a bag form, in a bag, 50 kg bag that you see. The other one is bulk cement. There's no bag, there's no something you sell it. That's typically sold to a ready mix concrete RMC company which mixes it and sells it. So in US, back in the day, there was a lot of distribution that happened many years ago. But gradually over time, RMC is 75% of the cement. So there is no, which is why I mentioned you won't see many distributors. As the countries have historically matured, the percentage of that distributor dealer has come down over time and largely you're selling through the RMC. So in US, you won't go see ads on cement companies and celebrities and all because there's no distribution angle to it. India is, as I mentioned, fairly unique where you have this large rural footprint, large housing market, which is the bulk of. So you still will see it, as of now, as we sit here today, we still have decent runway till we get to that stage. Eventually, if we follow the law of averages and normalization that we've seen in other countries, and one day we will reach there, but we'll see when we get there.
So Satya, obviously by definition, the true risks for the cement space, as it is for any other space, is the risk you can't foresee, right? Which is why you don't prepare for it. Are there things today that people are maybe not giving sufficient attention to that they should be thinking about a lot more? Maybe not immediately, but from a medium to long-term perspective, risks that you see or anything else that you think investors or people running cement companies should be thinking about and worrying about right now?
So there are two risks that I see. One is on the limestone front. The second one is, which I mentioned, we're all thinking that all these companies will lower the cost, become more efficient. But ultimately, who's going to be the beneficiary? So there is the Moore's law. So if you read the book, The Chip Wars, he's mentioned Moore, who actually went on to found Intel that we discussed earlier, that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit will keep on doubling every year for the next many, many years. And that was not based on any scientific law. That was just based on what was happening. And so something similar will keep on happening in cement. Also, we've seen Indian cement industry, all said and done, is one of the most efficient industries in the entire world. They have the lowest CO2 footprint. The kind of blending that we see somewhat in US and all, the amount of blending that you see is partly a function of the kind of market it's matured into more RMC and all. But India, the blending is well higher than what other countries have, and the amount of CO2 emissions is generally lower than you would see in other countries. So the industry is already efficient. It's going to get more efficient if we follow the Moore's law and see in other industries. But the challenge that I think people don't recognize in seeing other industries is what is the possibility of that being retained or passed on to the customer, and if you're investing so much in these. The other one is limestone. So ultimately, this is an industry where the key raw material that you have is limestone. If you don't have limestone, then either you're not able to maintain that production, you fade away in terms of production, or otherwise your cost of production will go up. So the main key barriers to entry of raw material is limestone. So back in the day, limestone used to be allotted to companies, which is why your limestone cost was fairly minuscule. But now in 2015, we had the MMDR Act that came in that basically stipulated that any new mines that come in have to be auctioned. So there has to be competitive bidding. You cannot arbitrarily give it to any particular company. But it also came with another precondition that any new mine obviously will be auctioned. But what about the existing mines? So you set up the entire infrastructure on a mine that you won, but the government said we cannot let you have this mine forever. These mines would also ultimately go into auction. But they gave a runway, so anybody who's invested so much capital in the entire industry, you can't just go and say tomorrow you give back the mine to me. So they came out with regulations that it has to be, if the mine was awarded, let's say sometime in the past, it has to complete 50 years and these I'm talking in the context of captive mines, which is what is relevant to cement, 50 years or 2030 or completion of the last renewal period, because earlier the mines were awarded on 15, 20-year basis, and on the expiry of that lease, they were renewed. So there are certain mines, very old mines, which were awarded, let's say, pre-1980, 1970. They will meet all these conditions, and these mines will expire and come up for auction. So there is a possibility. There are actually companies there whose mines are that old that they will expire, and the government, as the regulation that we have, obviously the industry is also pitching to give some kind of extension, and you can imagine any industry, but this is a law that is applicable not just to cement, the entire mining industry. And if we look at what happened in mineral auctions in 2020, there was no extension there. But if that happens, then there is something called right of first refusal, something similar to what we've seen in IPL. You have the most valuable player, you can match whatever others is and retain it. Same thing you have in cement, that somebody comes in, the mine is put on auction, somebody comes and bids 100% premium, and your cost of production goes up straight away by 400 rupees. So your EBITDA per ton that you're making of 1,000 rupees per ton suddenly shrinks to 600 rupees per ton, because somebody else has come and bid at 100%. And if you match that also, then your cost of production goes up by that amount. And if you don't match whatever you've invested, you lose it. So that is a risk to be seen for different companies, because some companies are well positioned. Whoever has a better footprint, they can keep investing in brownfield expansion, keep growing. Somebody who's not, you're looking at that kind of terminal risk right now as we stand. The other one is limestone depletion. So even though your lease is not expiring, you don't have enough reserves left to keep on producing forever. So those are certain limestone longer term risks to be aware of. And
it's really interesting listening to all this, just thinking about it right now. I'm imagining that I was running a, say, 5 or 10 million ton capacity company somewhere in India. And I'd be thinking how going ahead when these sorts of regulations kick in, I'm just not going to have the balance sheet to compete with some of the bigger guys. So I'm thinking that if I were in his shoes, more often than not, maybe the best thing is to just sell out and take your cash. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Or you think that despite all these regulations and changes that are coming in, smaller players or regional players will still be able to compete with the larger guys?
Right now, the way I see the industry in our conversations with the industry, even though there's a looming risk, I think there is some kind of denial till we get to that stage, because that's something still out 5 years from now. So, as of now, there might be some companies which might be evaluating that risk and see that if my cost of production is going to go up so much, then is it better to sell out? The others might still be thinking that let's wait and watch to see how much that cost actually goes up or not. Is there extension? What kind of general thought process is that if somebody else bid so aggressively for my mine, I would also bid aggressively. So why? But we've actually written in that note that not everybody is in the same boat. So it's not like your mine is at risk and somebody else's mine is also at risk. So there are different nuances to it, and not every company. But this might be one of the reasons for acquisition. Ultimately, the way I see it is I'm a tennis fan. So if I look at Djokovic, Nadal, and all. I'm playing tennis for so many years, and these guys keep on winning all the medals. What's the point of me barely surviving and existing and fading away? And no disrespect, anybody who's not Djokovic, Nadal, also, I know what kind of effort I can imagine gets to. So, and these companies also have invested in getting there. So there might be some players thinking that in this entire battle between these 2-3 guys, is it important for me to stick around, or maybe if I'm getting good valuation. So the assets that largely have been acquired, most of them have been so far largely cash strapped. And many of these companies have working capital issues, cash issues, in certain cases, succession challenges also. Maybe as of now, we've not seen limestone being one of the reasons for that. Barring one asset which was acquired, which we believe there might be some limestone issues, but otherwise, but that's something we'll have to wait and watch. But it's not just a matter of consolidation; it's actually assessing the companies when you, as an investor, that what could happen when you're giving valuation. Ultimately, valuation would be discounted value of cash flow. So, how do you assess that risk for an investor? Is something to be done.
So, Satya, one of my favorite headlines when it comes to cement, and I suppose just commodity cyclical industries generally, is, government plans X billion dollars of spend for the next 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, whatever. What I want to understand from you is it ever that easy as an investor? I can say, oh, there's $20 billion coming in. Why don't I buy a cement company? Or there's $20 billion coming in. Why don't I buy a steel company? Is it ever that easy as an investor?
I wish it was that easy. Our jobs would have been easier. If you look at the last 3 years in the Indian cement industry, and I'm using Indian cement industry as an example, the volumes have grown at almost 12-13% CAGR for the last 3 years. It's been a phenomenal demand growth that if you look at the previous decade, the overall Indian cement demand growth on an average was about somewhere between languishing in 5 to 6% volume CAGR. Last 3 years, we've grown at 13%. But if you look at the share price performance, cement industry, by and large, most players have significantly underperformed Nifty. Many have languished at the same levels. And if you look at 2020, when cement growth was actually negative, that's the best period to invest in a cement. That stock price is doubled in that era. So it's typically becomes, when you look at the entire, there are many facets to it. As I mentioned, the infra is 20% of the overall cement demand. Ultimately, housing is much bigger. But generally, we've seen positive correlation between, so usually when the infrastructure is growing, there is some support to housing also. So it's not like only one engine is firing and the other one is not. There could be various reasons, possible reasons I can speculate. One is when you have more infrastructure spending, then you have more labor which is employed in roads and all, and they get more income to spend on housing, which can go into the kacha to pakka, more capital stock. So generally, there has been some positive correlation. But if you look at fundamentally, infra alone cannot be the big driver for cement demand. The other one is structurally, there are certain things just to be cognizant of and see how they have played out in other countries. So if we see overall, there is some empirical evidence to suggest that whatever construction demand that we see, the cement, maybe the share of cement in the overall construction demand growth is somewhat lower than what it was historically, and that's something that could actually play out longer term. So if you look at steel to cement ratio, in India we have 400 million tons of cement consumption annually, and steel is 120, 130. So the steel to cement to steel ratio is 3:1. Globally, that ratio is 1:1. So if you look at what has happened in the China in the last few years, the cement production has declined at a much sharper rate than steel. So there's a possibility. The data suggests that that the 3:1 has peaked out in China and is gradually moving lower. In other markets, it is 1:1. So there is that possible angle that we need to be cognizant of. That even if, let's say, you have all this infra and all, as of now we are going, but longer term we'll have to see what kind of multiplier effect we have. And then longer term, the question becomes what kind of capital stock accumulation we as a country can keep on maintaining. After a while, you reach a stage where your capital stock is by and large matured, then you don't need as much new construction. You have largely replacement. If you look at some part of demand for cement, a large part, as I mentioned, is kacha to pakka housing. So if you go to rural housing, you largely have, if you have more income, what you do is you convert that kacha house into pakka house. You have 2 rooms, you add 1 more room, and then there is new capital stock, new housing and all. But the data suggests that there is a possibility that that kacha to pakka is relatively matured in terms of, if you look at the overall housing stock in that state, based on government data, that that might be will the room, incremental room for that kacha to pakka may not be as much as it was in the historical past. There are, within that overall infra theme, it's just some things to be cognizant of, but by and large, there is a positive correlation between infra and cement. But as I mentioned, we've seen such a strong demand growth environment, and we've not seen that. Partly, what we also have to see is if your demand is growing at X, what is your supply growing at Y level? Is it X plus 1, X minus 1? So what happens to your utilization? So you're trying to figure out is utilization. On that front also, empirically, there is no evidence to suggest, at least if we look at the last 5 years, 10 years data, that higher utilization translates into higher prices. So as an analyst, you may think that may happen, but which is one of the challenges of analyzing this industry. There are many personalities, many things involved in terms of market share, fights and stuff. The one thing we've seen is in the last few years, your cyclicality in the sector is tied to fuel prices. So fuel prices went up and you don't have the ability to pass on that kind of fuel cost inflation that you saw in 2020, 21, 22. So your margins shrunk. Then suddenly your cost came down so sharply and you don't pass it on immediately. So your margins expand. So you've seen that cyclicality. But overall, there's only one period where we've seen, this is called the super cycle in India. This was a period of 2006 to 2008 when suddenly you had these capacity expansions didn't materialize to the extent you imagine, and demand just shot up. We had these noughties and everything was real estate, infra, everything was firing, and utilization for cement industry went to 85% plus. Then you had the kind of pricing power we've never seen in the industry. And that was also a era of lower debt, higher debt on the balance sheet. So anyway, you was stressed, so you needed pricing, and you had very high utilization pricing power. So that period of 2006 to 8 is a period where you go and see that tightness in the overall supply translated very strongly with better pricing. So historically, empirically, that is what the data seems to suggest, that you need that kind of pricing to be absolutely sure that you'll have pricing. But within that, there is that challenge that empirically, how do you see there is that volatility. Sometimes utilization levels have actually gone up and it's that your margins have come down. And opposite has been the case when your utilizations have gone down, the margins have gone up.
Right.
Well, Satya, so many moving parts. I want to thank you for taking the time. It was really wonderful learning about the cement space. And I hope it was fun for you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Krishnan.
Thank you.